Racist officer threatened to make her disappear. Didn't know she runs the FBI. A cool breeze swept across the highway as the young woman drove quietly through a small town. The road was not too crowded, only a few cars passing by, and the late afternoon sun painted everything with a warm golden light. She was on her way to visit an old friend, and her car stereo played soft music in the background. To anyone who saw her, she looked like a regular traveler, wearing comfortable clothes and carrying a calm expression. But inside, she carried a secret that very few people in the world knew. She was one of the most powerful figures in the nation, though she never showed it through her appearance. As she drove, she noticed flashing red and blue lights appear in her rearview mirror. A police car was signaling her to pull over. She was a little surprised because she had not been speeding, and her car was in perfect condition. Still, she guided her vehicle to the side of the road and parked safely. Her heart didn't race, and she didn't panic. Instead, she calmly lowered the volume of the music and rolled down her window, waiting for the officer to approach. The officer walked over with heavy steps, his face set in a stern, almost hostile expression. He didn't greet her politely, nor did he explain why he had stopped her. Instead, he looked at her car, then at her, and frowned as though he had already decided something about her before she even spoke a word. She noticed the way his eyes narrowed, and she could feel the weight of his assumptions pressing into the silence. "License and registration," he said sharply, without any warmth in his voice. She nodded politely, reaching into her bag for her wallet. "Of course, officer," she replied, her tone calm and steady. She handed him her driver's license along with the vehicle papers, expecting him to check them and return as usual. But the officer didn't even glance at the documents properly. Instead, he leaned a little closer, squinting at her face as though he was looking for something that confirmed the picture he had already painted in his mind. "What are you doing around here?" he asked, his tone carrying suspicion rather than genuine curiosity. She kept her composure, her voice even. "I'm just passing through, heading to see a friend nearby." The officer's frown deepened. He looked over her car again, peered inside as if searching for something wrong, and then shook his head slowly. "People like you don't usually come through this town," he muttered, his words sharp enough to cut through the air. For a moment, she didn't respond. She had faced many situations in her life where people underestimated her or judged her unfairly. She knew very well how to stay composed in moments like this. "Is there something wrong with my car, officer?" she asked gently. Instead of answering her question, the officer stepped back slightly, resting his hand on his belt. "You should watch your attitude," he said in a cold voice. "I could make things very difficult for you if I wanted." Her hands stayed calmly on the steering wheel, her breathing steady. She wasn't intimidated, but she also wasn't careless. She knew that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. The officer looked frustrated by her calmness, as if he wanted her to show fear or anger so that he could react. When she didn't, he leaned closer again and whispered something that carried a weight much heavier than the uniform he wore. "You should be careful," he said slowly. "If you don't do exactly as I say, I can make you disappear. Nobody would ever know." The words hung in the air like a shadow. To most people, hearing something like that would send chills down their spine. But the woman's expression didn't change. She had faced greater dangers than this, and she carried responsibilities far heavier than this roadside encounter. Instead of reacting with shock, she simply blinked, her calm eyes meeting his. Inside her mind, she thought of the irony of the moment. The man who was threatening her believed he had power over her, when in reality, his entire career and reputation could be shaken by a single word from her. She was the director of the FBI, the head of the nation's most powerful investigative agency. Every law enforcement officer, including this one, technically worked under the system she was leading. Yet here he was, treating her as though she had no rights, no voice, no authority. The officer seemed to mistake her silence for fear. He smirked faintly, satisfied with what he thought was control. "That's what I thought," he muttered, stepping back and crossing his arms. "You just keep quiet, and maybe you'll get out of here without trouble." She let the moment stretch, choosing not to reveal herself just yet. She wanted to see how far this officer would go, how he carried himself when he believed no one was watching. Her training and experience taught her that real character was revealed in hidden moments like these. The way a person acted when they thought they held the upper hand said everything about who they truly were. Cars passed slowly on the highway, some drivers glancing curiously at the scene but not stopping. To them, it looked like a simple traffic stop, something routine. They had no idea that a silent test of power and dignity was unfolding right before their eyes. The officer walked around her car, pretending to check her tires and windows, though it was clear he was just buying time, searching for an excuse to escalate the situation. She stayed calm, her hands still resting on the steering wheel, her breathing steady. Her patience was not weakness, it was strength, the kind of quiet strength that only someone with immense self-control could show. Finally, the officer returned to her window, tapping his finger on the edge of the glass. "I'm watching you," he said coldly. "Don't think you can get away with anything here. People like you don't just drive around without drawing attention." Her lips curved into the faintest of smiles, not mocking, not bitter, but knowing. She didn't need to defend herself to him. She didn't need to argue or protest. She had nothing to prove. She was already more powerful than he could ever imagine. And as she sat there, quietly observing him, she thought about how moments like this were why her position mattered so much. It wasn't about titles, offices, or the respect she commanded in Washington. It was about situations just like this one. It was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves from arrogance, from misuse of authority, from threats that should never be spoken by those sworn to serve and protect. The roadside stop continued, but inside her heart, she already knew this was not just another encounter. This was the beginning of something bigger, a story that would not end here. She didn't rush to reveal her identity yet, but the officer had no idea that his words, spoken so carelessly, would soon echo far beyond this quiet town. The woman looked straight ahead, the fading sunlight glinting softly on her face, and waited calmly for the next move. The officer's words still lingered in the air as he stood beside her car. The woman's calm expression did not waver, but inside she quietly measured the weight of the moment. To her, this was not just about one rude officer. It was about the picture he painted with his behavior, an image of arrogance and misplaced power. She sat still, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, showing no sign of being rattled. The officer, misreading her silence as fear, leaned in again. "You think I'm joking," he said, his voice sharp but lowered as if to intimidate her. "I could make one phone call, and you wouldn't be heard from again." His words carried the confidence of someone who had used threats before, someone who believed his badge gave him control over people. But what he didn't know was that the person sitting in front of him was not an ordinary traveler. She was the director of the FBI, a woman who held one of the highest positions in law enforcement. Her very job was to ensure that threats like this were exposed, challenged, and corrected. She stayed calm, letting him speak, letting him reveal his true self without interruption. Years of training had taught her that sometimes the most powerful action was not immediate reaction, but observation. She studied his tone, his body language, and his assumptions. Every detail would matter later. Finally, she spoke in a voice steady and even, not defensive, not shaken. "Officer, I believe I've given you everything you asked for. My license and registration are in order. May I ask what the reason is for stopping me?" Her words were polite, but they also carried a quiet strength. She wasn't begging for understanding, nor was she arguing. She was simply reminding him that there were rules, that he had responsibilities, and that he was crossing lines he should never cross. But the officer didn't respond to the question directly. He crossed his arms and gave a short laugh, as though the very idea of her asking for an explanation offended him. "The reason," he repeated, smirking. "The reason is that I don't like when people act like they have nothing to hide. Everyone has something to hide." She tilted her head slightly, her eyes calm and watchful. He didn't realize it, but every word he spoke was only tightening the rope around his own authority. He was giving her everything she needed to know about his character. The officer walked back to his car, pretending to check her license, though she noticed he spent more time glancing back at her than looking at the papers. After a few minutes, he returned, still with the same stern look. "Step out of the car," he ordered. Her heart remained steady, her face unchanged. Slowly, she unbuckled her seat belt and stepped out, standing tall beside her vehicle. She didn't shrink under his gaze. Instead, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had stood in far tougher places than this. The officer circled her, as though trying to find a weakness. "Do you understand who you're dealing with?" he asked, his tone sharp again. For the first time, she allowed a small smile to touch her lips, though it wasn't mocking. It was the smile of someone who knew a truth that the other person had yet to discover. "I understand very well," she said gently. "Do you?" The officer frowned, confused by her calmness. He had expected fear, nervousness, or anger. But what he saw was control, steady, quiet control that made him uneasy even though he didn't admit it. As she stood there, the late afternoon sun now dipping closer to the horizon, she decided the time had come. She had given him a chance to show restraint, to behave professionally, but he had chosen otherwise. Without rushing, she reached into her bag and pulled out a slim leather folder. She opened it slowly, revealing an official badge and identification that caught the sunlight just enough to gleam. She held it up steadily, her eyes never leaving his. The officer's expression froze. His smirk vanished instantly as he leaned forward, squinting at the badge. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out at first. He blinked, then blinked again, as though his eyes were deceiving him. But there was no mistake. The name, the title, and the seal were clear. She closed the folder calmly and slipped it back into her bag. "Now," she said softly, "do you want to repeat what you just said to me?" The silence that followed was heavy. The officer's posture stiffened, his face shifting from arrogance to disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words stumbled out unevenly. I didn't realize." Her expression remained calm, but now there was no smile. There was only clarity. "You didn't realize," she said firmly, "because you didn't care to know. You thought your words had no consequences. You thought your position allowed you to treat me however you wished. But every word you spoke is recorded in my memory, and it will be addressed." The officer's hands twitched nervously. He glanced toward the passing cars, suddenly aware of how exposed he was. His confidence had drained away, replaced by a quiet panic. She didn't raise her voice, nor did she show anger. That wasn't her way. Her authority didn't need shouting to be felt. Her presence, her truth, and her role were more powerful than any threat he could make. After a long pause, she stepped closer, her voice lowering but steady as ever. "When you wear that uniform, you carry more than a badge. You carry trust, responsibility, and the lives of people who expect fairness. If you forget that, then you don't belong in it." The officer swallowed hard, his face pale now. The arrogance was gone. In its place was the realization that he had spoken to the wrong person, and worse, that he had revealed the truth of his character to someone who could hold him accountable. She let the silence settle again before stepping back. Her calmness remained unbroken, but inside she knew this was more than just a personal encounter. This was a glimpse into a system that still had cracks that needed to be repaired. Without another word, she returned to her car, opened the door, and sat down. She didn't drive away immediately. Instead, she looked out the window, meeting his eyes one last time. The message in her gaze was clear: his threats had no power over her, and soon, his actions would be brought into the light. The officer stood frozen, unsure of whether to apologize, retreat, or pretend nothing had happened. But deep down, he knew that his words, spoken in arrogance, had already set events in motion that he could no longer control. The engine of her car hummed softly as she started it again, and she drove forward with the same calm grace she had carried from the beginning. But now the officer knew the truth, and the weight of that truth pressed heavier on him with each passing second. The evening air was growing cooler as the sun dropped lower in the sky. The woman's car moved slowly down the highway, the officer's shocked face still fresh in her memory. She didn't smile, and she didn't feel triumph in revealing her identity. For her, this wasn't about pride. It was about truth. She had seen countless situations where power was misused, but this one struck her differently. Here she was, the director of the FBI, being threatened on the side of the road simply because someone assumed she had no voice. She thought carefully about how the officer had behaved. Every word he spoke, every look he gave, told her more than just his personal attitude. It revealed a mindset, one that was dangerous if left unchecked. And as she continued driving, she knew this moment wasn't over. The officer might have been silenced for now, but accountability had only just begun. The road stretched out ahead, long and quiet, but her thoughts remained focused. She replayed the scene in her mind, not with anger, but with a sense of duty. She knew the weight of her role wasn't just about leading investigations or overseeing operations from behind a desk. It was also about facing situations like this up close, personal, and raw. Not far behind her, the police car that had pulled her over was now parked on the shoulder. The officer hadn't followed her. He had stayed behind, probably frozen in disbelief, wondering what this meant for him. He had no idea how far the consequences could go, and she didn't need to tell him. He would find out soon enough. After another hour of driving, she reached her destination, a quiet home in the suburbs where her close friend lived. The friend greeted her warmly at the door, noticing the calm but thoughtful look on her face. "Long drive?" her friend asked with a smile. "It was eventful," she replied gently, stepping inside. Over dinner, she shared the story, not as a complaint but as a recount of what had happened. Her friend listened carefully, eyes widening at the details, especially at the part where the officer had threatened her. "And he said that to you?" the friend asked, shocked. She nodded, sipping her tea slowly. "Yes. But the truth is, it doesn't matter that he said it to me. What matters is that he felt free to say it at all. If he could say that to me, imagine how many others he has said it to. People without the power to answer back." Her words carried weight, and her friend sat in thoughtful silence for a while. The woman leaned back, her eyes thoughtful. "I've always believed that leadership isn't about titles," she said softly. "It's about responsibility. Tonight reminded me why I do what I do. Not for the offices in Washington, not for the meetings or the briefings, but for people who can't stand up to this kind of abuse." Later that night, after her friend had gone to bed, she sat quietly by the window with her laptop. She opened it and began typing a detailed report of what had happened. Every word, every phrase the officer used, every action he took, she recorded it carefully. Not as an act of anger, but as part of her duty. She wasn't just a victim of his words, she was a witness, and she owed it to her role and to others to make sure this incident was not hidden in the shadows. The next morning, she contacted her office directly. Her assistant answered with his usual brisk tone. "Good morning, Director. Do you need me to prepare today's schedule?" "Not yet," she said calmly. "I need you to log an incident report. Personal encounter. It involves an officer from a small town department. I'll send the details. Make sure it goes to Internal Affairs and the Civil Rights Division." There was a pause on the other end. The assistant's tone softened. "Understood, ma'am. I'll take care of it right away." By mid-morning, the information was already in the right hands. Investigations like this didn't happen overnight, but she knew the system well. Once the process began, there was no turning back. The officer's actions would be examined, his record checked, his behavior evaluated. She didn't need to interfere, she simply needed to let the truth do its work. Meanwhile, back in the small town, the officer woke with a heavy heart. The memory of her badge, the title stamped across it, haunted him. At first, he tried to convince himself that maybe she wouldn't take it further, that maybe she'd let it slide. But deep down, he knew better. She wasn't just any traveler. She was the one person who had the power to ensure his words did not vanish into thin air. At the station, his colleagues noticed his unusual quietness. "Rough night?" one of them asked casually. He forced a smile. "Something like that," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. But his mind was far away, replaying the scene over and over. He thought about how easily he had spoken, how quickly he had let his arrogance take control. Now those careless words could end everything he had built. Days passed, and whispers began to move through the department. Someone had heard that Internal Affairs was looking into their town. Rumors spread fast, and the officer felt the walls closing in. He tried to act normal, but inside he was unraveling. For the woman, though, the days carried on with quiet determination. She attended her meetings, reviewed national security briefings, and handled her duties as director with the same sharp focus she always had. But behind it all, she knew that accountability was moving forward in its own steady way. She didn't seek revenge, nor did she seek to humiliate the officer. Her purpose was much larger. It wasn't just about him, it was about the system that allowed behavior like his to go unchecked. She hoped that by bringing this to light, it would remind others in uniform of the responsibility they carried. One evening, as she sat in her office in Washington, she received a call from one of her senior staff members. "Director, the review has started. They're looking into the officer's record. It seems this isn't the first complaint against him." She closed her eyes for a brief moment, not surprised but saddened. "I expected that," she said softly. "Make sure it's thorough. This isn't just about one night. It's about patterns." As the call ended, she sat back in her chair, gazing out at the city lights. The world outside moved with its usual noise and energy, but inside her office, there was a quiet truth she held onto. Leadership wasn't about showing power. It was about using responsibility to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. And in this case, it meant standing firm against the arrogance of one officer so that others might be spared in the future. The days following the incident turned into weeks, but the memory of the roadside encounter did not fade. For the officer, every day at the station felt heavier than the one before. At first, he tried to convince himself that maybe nothing would come of it. He thought perhaps the woman he had threatened would not follow through, that she would be too busy with her own responsibilities to bother with a small town officer. But as time passed, the signs became clearer. Questions were being asked. Files were being pulled. Internal Affairs was no longer just a distant name, it was knocking at the doors of his department. Meanwhile, in Washington, the woman carried on with her responsibilities as director of the FBI. She didn't dwell on the incident every day, but she never forgot the importance of it either. She had reported it not because of her own feelings, but because of the larger message it carried. She knew her position demanded more than silence. Her duty was to make sure that systems designed to protect people did not turn into weapons against them. She reviewed the reports coming in from the Civil Rights Division and Internal Affairs. What they uncovered was troubling but not surprising. The officer in question had a history, complaints filed against him by citizens who claimed he used intimidation, harsh words, and unnecessary force. Many of those complaints had been dismissed or ignored at the local level. It was a familiar pattern, people too afraid to push back, and a system too comfortable to hold one of its own accountable. The investigation gained momentum, and the story slowly began to move beyond closed doors. Local officials grew nervous as they realized the seriousness of the matter. The name of the woman who had been stopped was not just any name, it was the director of the FBI. News spread quietly at first, then more openly, until the town itself was buzzing with whispers. "Did you hear who that traveler really was?" people asked each other. "Do you know who the officer threatened?" Back at the department, the officer tried to carry himself as if nothing was wrong, but the looks from his colleagues told him otherwise. Some avoided him, not wanting to be connected to the trouble he was now in. Others watched him carefully, silently judging him for the mess he had created. He felt the walls closing in, and for the first time in years, he realized his badge could not shield him from the truth. For the woman, the unfolding events were not about one man's downfall. They were about something larger. She thought of the citizens who had filed complaints in the past, their voices unheard, their fears dismissed. She thought of people who never got the chance to be believed because their word was weighed against an officer's uniform. That was what pushed her forward, the knowledge that accountability was not just personal, but collective. She called a meeting with her senior staff. In a large conference room, with files spread across the table, she spoke with calm authority. "This case is not about headlines," she told them. "It is about trust. If one officer believes he can threaten someone and walk away without consequence, then others may think the same. We cannot allow that. The people we serve must know that justice does not bend to uniforms or badges, it stands above them." Her staff listened intently, nodding in agreement. One of them asked gently, "Director, do you want to make this public yet?" She paused for a moment before answering. "Not yet," she said firmly. "Let the investigation finish. Let the facts speak for themselves. When the time is right, the truth will come out, and it will not be a matter of opinion but of evidence." The following weeks were filled with interviews, reviews of past complaints, and detailed checks of the officer's record. Every piece of information painted the same picture: a man who had misused the power of his uniform for far too long. The woman did not celebrate these findings. Her heart was heavy with the thought of how many people had been affected before she crossed paths with him. In the small town, the officer felt the shift in the air. He noticed how residents who once nodded at him now looked away. He felt the unease whenever he walked into a room, the whispers that stopped when he passed by. It was no longer a secret people knew, and their silence spoke louder than words. One afternoon, he was called into the chief's office. The chief's face was stern, his voice measured. "There's an investigation underway. It's serious. I suggest you cooperate fully." The officer nodded, though inside he felt a storm raging. He had built his identity on the authority of his badge, and now that authority was slipping away. He couldn't stop thinking about the calm look in the woman's eyes the day she revealed who she was. That calmness haunted him more than any loud argument could have. While the officer wrestled with fear and uncertainty, the woman continued her work in Washington. She met with other officials, discussed national matters, and led her teams with focus. But beneath it all, she carried the quiet reminder of her roadside experience. It gave her perspective, grounding her in the reality that power was not about control, it was about service. Eventually, the day came when the investigation reached its conclusion. The findings were clear, and the recommendation was firm: the officer should be removed from his position. His record showed a pattern too dangerous to ignore. It was not just about one mistake but about years of behavior that eroded trust in the very system he was supposed to protect. When she received the final report, she read it slowly, carefully. She didn't feel joy or satisfaction, only a steady sense of responsibility. She knew that removing him from his role would not erase the harm he had done, but it would prevent future harm. It was a step toward justice, however small compared to the larger work still ahead. News of the decision spread quickly, first through the town, then across the country. Media outlets picked up the story, framing it as a shocking tale, a local officer threatening the very person who oversaw the nation's law enforcement. But beyond the surprise of the headline, people began to discuss something deeper: the importance of accountability, the dangers of unchecked authority, and the reminder that no one is above the law. In her office, the woman watched the coverage quietly. Her face remained calm, her heart steady. She had not sought publicity, but she understood that sometimes stories needed to be told to spark change. She hoped that this one would remind other officers of their duty and encourage citizens to believe in the power of their voices. The officer, stripped of his badge, sat in silence in his home. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of consequences he could not escape. His threats, once spoken with confidence, had become the very words that ended his career. He thought back to the moment on the roadside, to the calm woman who had not raised her voice but had carried an authority greater than his. It was a lesson he had learned too late. And for the woman, the story was not about him anymore. It was about what came next. She knew the fight for fairness and justice was far from over, but she carried with her the reminder that even small encounters on quiet roads could reveal great truths. It was a reminder that her role was not just about leading from behind a desk, but about standing firm in the face of injustice, wherever it appeared. The story of the roadside encounter and its aftermath spread far beyond the small town. Newspapers carried headlines that surprised many: a police officer had threatened someone on a quiet road, not knowing that the person in front of him was the director of the FBI. People across the country read the details with disbelief. Some shook their heads at the officer's arrogance, while others felt a deep sense of relief that his actions had finally been exposed. For many, the story wasn't just about one officer and one powerful woman. It was about a system that needed constant attention and care to remain fair. In Washington, the woman watched the conversation unfold. Her name was being mentioned on television and in articles, but she didn't focus on the attention. Instead, she paid close attention to the discussions people were having. Families were talking about accountability at dinner tables, communities were holding meetings about the importance of trust in law enforcement, and young people were learning about the power of calm courage in difficult moments. She knew her position gave weight to the story, but in her heart, she wanted people to see beyond her title. She wanted them to see that the real message was that no one, whether a traveler on the road or a leader in the government, should be threatened or mistreated by those meant to protect them. In the weeks that followed, the incident became a teaching point across many departments. Training sessions were updated, reminding officers about the importance of respect, fairness, and responsibility. Supervisors spoke about the dangers of letting arrogance guide actions. Many officers, both young and experienced, reflected on the story and quietly promised themselves that they would never let power blind them to their duty. The woman continued her work with the same steady focus she always had. She didn't let the attention distract her. Every day, she met with teams, reviewed important cases, and made decisions that shaped the nation's security. But the roadside encounter stayed in her mind as a reminder that leadership was not about the size of the office or the sound of applause. It was about small moments when character was tested. One afternoon, she was invited to speak at a national law enforcement conference. Leaders from across the country gathered in a large hall, waiting to hear her words. When she stepped onto the stage, the room grew silent. She looked across the audience, her calm gaze resting on the rows of men and women in uniform. She began with a simple story, not about power, not about titles, but about that quiet road and the officer who thought threats could silence her. She told the story carefully, never raising her voice, never speaking with anger. Instead, she shared it as a lesson. The badge you wear, she said softly, is not a shield for arrogance. It is a promise of service. Every person you meet is deserving of respect, no matter who they are or where they come from. When we forget that, we lose more than trust, we lose the very purpose of our duty. The hall remained silent as her words settled over the crowd. Many in the audience lowered their heads, reflecting on their own actions. Others sat still, feeling the weight of the responsibility she described. Her voice carried not just authority, but sincerity, and that sincerity was what reached the hearts of those listening. When she finished, the room erupted into applause. It was not the loud cheer of celebration but the steady sound of respect. She stepped off the stage quietly, not seeking recognition, but knowing that her words had planted seeds of reflection that could grow into real change. Back in the small town where it all began, the officer who had once spoken with such arrogance now lived in silence. Without his badge, he had lost the authority he once relied on. He kept to himself, aware that people remembered the story. It was a lesson that had come too late for him, but perhaps his mistakes would prevent others from repeating them. For the townspeople, the story became a reminder that truth eventually comes to light. Some remembered the day they drove past her car on the side of the road, not realizing what was happening. Now they told their children about it, explaining why respect and fairness were more important than power. The woman herself didn't dwell on the officer's fate. She had done her duty, and that was enough. She knew her role wasn't about punishing one man, it was about protecting many people. She carried herself with the same calm dignity she had shown that day on the road, knowing that her true strength lay not in titles but in the way she chose to respond to injustice. Months later, while reviewing a case late in her office, she thought back to that golden evening light on the highway. She remembered how quietly she had sat in her car, listening to the officer's threats, waiting for the right moment to reveal who she was. She remembered the look of disbelief on his face when the truth unfolded. And she remembered her own calmness, not anger, not fear, but the steady strength of someone who knew the power of patience. She smiled faintly, not at the memory of his downfall, but at the reminder of why she served. Every challenge, every test, every injustice she faced was not about her but about the people she represented. She carried the responsibility of protecting their trust, and that responsibility gave her strength greater than any threat could take away. The story lived on, not as a tale of embarrassment for one officer, but as a reminder of dignity, accountability, and the quiet power of truth. People retold it in classrooms, in community meetings, and in homes. Each time, it carried the same message, that respect is the foundation of justice, and that no one is beyond accountability. For the woman, the road continued forward, filled with new challenges and responsibilities. But in her heart, she carried the memory of that evening as a compass. It reminded her that even in the smallest towns and on the quietest roads, the values of fairness, respect, and courage mattered most. And as long as she lived by those values, she knew she would never lose her way.